You are listening to Prevention is the New Cure, all things health and NHS with a political twist.
And that's with me, Dr. Helen Stokes-Lampard, and Steve Brine, former MP and chair of the Health Select Committee.
Good morning, Helen.
Hello, Steve.
Do you remember a few weeks ago we had Gemma Peters on from Macmillan? And you rather inappropriately mentioned her hair. Now, you've already mentioned my hair this morning in our pre-chat.
I had, Steve, you were fishing for a compliment that was already going to come your way. You are looking very sharp this morning, if I may say so. That is a serious haircut. You have been, what's the phrase? You have been groomed extensively. Is that
Well,
is
my
that
son
good?
says it's a buzz cut, but I'm not so sure. What do you know? What I as I get older, Helen, I do you remember that TV show called Room 101?
I do. Certainly
And
do.
I sort of, when we're in the car with the kids and Susie, who just despair of it, I just got this room 101 that's expanding all the time with things that I'd like to put in this room 101. One of which is, right, when you, well, you don't know, but when you're queuing in the men's barbers, it's just sort of come in, queue, next one, next. People keep coming in and I find them sitting in front of me and they've got no hair. Like,
Indeed.
you,
Yeah.
what is that?
What, no hair? I'm married to a man who has no hair, Steve. It is, except he doesn't pay anyone to remove his hair for him. He just uses his own clippers in the bathroom. It's very efficient and it's very cool. And do you know how long it takes him to wash his hair in the shower? About 10
30,
seconds. Yeah.
yeah. But people keep, you see people in the hairdressers who don't have any hair and they're coming in, and I just wonder, it seems to take ages as well. The trouble is these days is I go to the Turkish barbers.
Oh, very nice. Did you get the
Yeah,
whole hot towels thing as well?
well, this is what I'm saying,
Yeah.
is that once you've done your ears and your eyebrows and your nose, it doesn't matter whether you want any hair on your head. There's plenty of work to be done.
Well, you see, there's a whole new industry that's been created here, isn't there? Because you're right. I remember as a kid going with my dad to the barber and then later with my husband. And then once he did what he calls the reluctant engineer thing. You get to a certain point when it's falling out anyway, and you might as well just get rid of the lot and have done with it. You've got to have a sufficient amount of hair to make it worthwhile going to the barbers until they created all the other things they can do to your face and other bits of body hair. So no, it's a whole new industry, Steve. But as a woman who has booked her hair appointments months and months in advance for many years, I really can't talk. I have my
I've
sixth.
never booked a hair appointment in my life. It
Oh,
just
Steve.
reminds me, just finally, is that when we first moved to Winchester, I went to this very old hairdresser, this barber, this chap who was in his 80s, in City Road in Winchester, and it's now a food store. Anyway, and he was cutting my hair, and he was telling me about this chap who came in just after the war, who was based in Winchester, as many were, and he didn't have much hair.
Right.
And so he stood behind him and he sort of snip, pretended to snip, made a few noises, sprayed the spray a few times, and then held up the mirror behind this army captain. And he said, "What are you happy with this, sir?" And he said, "You be fool, you've scalped me."
Oh,
So he
marvelous.
said,
Anyway.
"Listen, the moral of the story is, even when they've got no hair, give the customer what they want," which is probably a good, good moral for life.
Well,
Anyway,
it is. Yeah,
I somehow don't know how we've digressed into that, but there you go. Apologies. This is episode 37 of Prevention is the New Cure. Now, last time we were talking a bit when we were about the political landscape. We're talking about some of the industrial action that's coming along
hmm
now with general practice, which we'll talk about later on in pod surgery. And we had Dr. Ian Walker, who sent us a lovely email after being on. And he is from CRUK, Cancer Research UK. He was talking about the whole smoking cessation, smoking policy, and the delayed legislation here in the UK, but through the lens of New Zealand, which obviously where you're off to for your next assignment. And he's just been to on a fact-finding mission. And interesting guy.
It was really interesting, and it was good to have a chance to talk about the New Zealand health and political landscape. It's sort of a juxtaposition to what we're going through here. But he was really lovely guy, and I appreciated his insights. But I was also quite impressed, if you recall last time, Steve, about your crystal ball and some of the predictions you'd been making about what was to come to pass. But anyway, you're back from holiday, aren't you? Because you were speaking to us from Cornwall last time we recorded.
Yeah, we had a few connection problems, didn't we, in our recording? But it sounded okay in the end, thanks to our
Yeah.
wonderful Alex on Tech
Yeah,
Ops.
thanks, Alex.
But yeah, I was down in Cornwall actually. Normally we go to Devon. We go down to Devon on holiday, but because I had a 16-year-old who was at Boardmasters,
Oh,
the festival, the rite of
yeah.
passage for 16, 17-year-olds, Helen, we would look so out of place. I mean, you wouldn't, I would, even with my hair.
Lovely.
Yeah. See how I recovered that. So yes, we were down in Charlestown in Cornwall,
Right.
and we were down there during the festival, and then we moved across to this amazing place, sort of inland, called Lost Withiel. Do you know that part of the world
No,
at
not
all?
at all.
Oh my goodness! Like what a community Lost Withiel is. I've actually emailed them since we left to say how much we enjoyed being in their town. Just really, really lovely. We were there in Carnival Week. There was so much going on, and
Oh,
we really enjoyed it as a family actually. So yeah, we got back, and I came back via the land of your fathers. Came back
not
via Cardiff, where I
tidy.
went to see my best friend and played golf in the Vale of Glamorgan.
Nice.
Spent a bit of time in the centre of Cardiff, which I haven't done for years, and
Beautiful, isn't it? Really lovely
now I'm
city.
back home. Yeah.
Well, can I tell you, my Cardiff connection is I'm very proud auntie because my wonderful nephew Josh just got into medical school in Cardiff, so he'll be starting there in a couple of weeks' time, which is great. So, as one of my friends said, finally Helen gets her medical dynasty. So, yeah, very excited for him and
Congrats to him.
anybody else who's got into med school or nursing college or any other course. And is starting in a few weeks' time. It's a very exciting new chapter for everyone. So, yeah, good luck to them
Should
all.
we look at what's on the list this time?
We should. It's not a happy bunch. It's a lot of negative stuff this time, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of controversy, a lot of criticisms, lots of disagreements. But, that's for a change. It's not coming from Westminster because Westminster's on summer recess, but sort of in the medical world, if you like. So we're going to talk about the Nottingham killings, the
Yeah,
Valdo Calocane case. We're going to talk a bit about CQC and the challenges that they've been doing. There's been some quite interesting criticism of the Grail
yeah,
multi-detection early cancer test, which we have had on the podcast before. So we're going to talk a bit about that. We talk a bit about MPox,
yeah,
and we're going to talk a bit about puberty blockers,
yeah.
among
It's a good
other
list.
things.
I was going to say just as well. We haven't got a guest this week, right? Where should we begin? Not
Let's
Nottingham.
start with Nottingham.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, you will know that the families of these victims in Nottingham, where they awful killings, um, they have said that those responsible for failings in the care of the man convicted of these killings have blood on their hands, quote, end quote.
Yeah,
So young Barnaby Webber, who was 19, Grace O'Malley Kumar, who was 19, and a 65-year-old Ian Coates, they were killed by Calocane, who was suffering from psychotic and paranoid delusions back in June of 2023. And a review that was published last week by the Care Quality Commission found, quote, a series of errors, omissions, and misjudgments by mental health services. And the families basically said that those organizations involved in his care, or not as they see it, must bear a pretty heavy burden of responsibility. And that's what led them to say they have blood on their hands. Is
yeah.
that a fair summary?
I mean, I think evocative language about blood on people's hands is not usually helpful. It's completely understandable where it's coming from. And goodness, your heart goes out to the families here. I mean, what just the most awful, terrible tragedy when somebody whose mind is so disturbed goes on a rampage, killing and injuring completely innocent people. I think this throws up all the usual challenges about resourcing and mental health services in general. We know there's been a massive increase in demand on mental health services. We're very overdue for reform of the Mental Health Act. And I do think that mental health is often, despite the massive increase in people talking about mental health issues and public awareness, it is still very much a bit of a Cinderella side of things when it comes to funding and resource. And it certainly looks from what CQC is saying that that was a factor here. People had raised concerns for quite a long time. One interesting thing I wanted to flag with you, somebody well known to both of us, is Professor Sir Simon Wesley. Now, he was the architect behind what is to become a new Mental Health Act in due course. He's spoken really well about this in the public. He spoke on the Today programme last week, and I think he was on Sky News a couple of days ago, saying that people have started questioning whether the new Mental Health Act is the right thing in the view of this case. And what he said is that the act is desperately long-term overdue. And he's very happy that there should be a pause for people to reflect on what the new act is going to contain to see if it could help in a situation like this. So if new Secretary of State hasn't got confidence, because I think Wes Streeting has spoken out about this and being fairly scathing himself. But no legislation is going to help in a situation like this where you've got somebody who is so disturbed. And I think that's the problem. All the powers in the current legislation are there. It's just they weren't applied sufficiently in this case, is my understanding. What do you think?
Yes, and the Secretary of State has been pretty scathing. You're right. He said what, in his view, was so shocking is there were so many failures and fundamental failures in terms of the supervision of this man, the provision of his medication, then what happened when he wasn't taking his medication, and then he was discharged for not attending, when actually non-attendance should have provoked even closer
Red
supervision.
flag.
So I
Yeah.
suppose for me, Helen, the point here is one of identification, early identification of a of a serious acute mental health challenge before it is a serious acute mental health challenge, because prevention is better than
Better.
cure, or
Yeah.
the new cure, as someone said. And then it's about the management thereof, isn't it? And I'm not sure that is about legislation. That is surely about what you're saying, which is organization and resources, and then management of that condition. Because, as you rightly put in your comments, the important point here is that how much can the state, how much can the system prevent somebody from acting out their paranoid delusions, versus how much can they prevent it in the first place? And
Yeah.
that is a really difficult balance. And I think, the Prime Minister's talked about there being a judge-led inquiry into this, and that's of course welcome, as long as it doesn't mean some very long grass that takes years, comes up with recommendations that have already been made and not implemented in other cases.
Yeah.
That's fine, but is it about resources and organization as much as it is about the legislation that Simon rightly recommended and will be in the new Mental Health Act that was announced in the King's Speech?
Yeah, just actually one last thing that Simon apparently said yesterday was he raised the fact that this fantastic change in public awareness about mental health issues and a reduction in the stigma about talking about mental health issues has had an unintended consequence, in that the NHS is completely swamped by demand for mental health support and services from people, particularly those on the much milder end, totally different from Valdo Caliconi. And the NHS was never set up for that. So support systems and social structures would previously have done a lot of this. People would have gone to friends and family, they'd have gone to religious leaders, they would have gone to colleagues with their mild to moderate anxiety, depressive symptoms, and we've had a lot of major global triggers to worsen these. And actually, the NHS is now trying to help as best it can, but of course, a lot of resources then going to that end of the care system. And I'm not sure that he was saying it directly, but of course the implicit thing is does that mean that more intense and more severe end of services haven't had the attention they deserve? Anyway, one to watch for, I would say.
Yeah, and it is, it's just obviously it's a personal tragedy times three for those families, and it's a huge challenge, another huge challenge for the state, isn't it?
And
Let's
no,
talk.
just sorry, one last thing, Steve. I mean, going back to that original comment, and you asked me about the phrase blood on their hands. The reason I find language like that really difficult is because 3 lives were unnecessarily lost. That is a fact, and it is horrific, and nothing's going to bring them back. When it comes to blame, the temptation is to blame individuals for things that are almost invariably turned out to be systemic organizational failures. And you can point fingers and say one person's got blood on their hands for this thing or that thing, but invariably it's that Swiss cheese model of an awful lot of things lining up for one terrible thing to happen. And yeah, I people in the health service almost invariably, and there's one or two notable exceptions, but almost invariably are desperately caring, desperately trying to do their best. And I do see some people scapegoated at times like this, and I don't want to see that happen either.
Yes, we've talked a lot on this podcast about cancer,
Mm.
rightly, the prevention of cancer and the early detection of cancer, which, as we know, early detection is cancer's magic key. One of the exciting innovations in this space is what's known as multi-cancer early detection tests, snappy
Mhm.
title, and specifically something called the NHS Gallery trial, which we talked about on the podcast with Harpal Kumar, who used to run CR UK and now leads Grail, in episode 26. So it was
Oh, well, you
March.
spotted. Well done. Yeah.
March of this year, we talked about it. And obviously, we had a long chat with him, and that episode is still there wherever you get your podcasts. But we both read the BMJ each week, don't we? And I messaged you on our WhatsApp group for the podcast earlier in the week, on the weekend actually, and said, "Did you see that article on the BMJ, which had the holy grail of blood tests? Question mark. New evidence cast doubt on a much hyped screening tool." And it seems that there's a big article here in the BMJ which talks about documents leaked to them, saying that the criteria being used, unpublished until now, till they published it, are unsuitable to justify a new national screening program. They say that Mike Richards, chair of the independent UK National Screening Committee, who we both know and who I worked with in ministerial office,
The
has
mic.
privately voiced serious concerns to Amanda Pritchard, NHS England's chief executive, about the trial and its ability to provide sufficient evidence, quotes, on whether the benefits of testing outweigh any potential harms and at reasonable cost. Now, Grail have sent us their response. We'll touch on that in a minute. What are your initial reactions, Helen, to the actual piece itself in the BMJ?
So, first things first, reminder of my potential or perceived conflict of interest here, because I chair the independent, please note, independent clinical oversight group for this trial. I take no money for that. I'm unpaid for that. I do it because it's just really interesting to follow the progress of a brand new type of test. And for the avoidance of doubt, there are many, many multi-cancer early detection tests in development, a small number of them out there. This gallery test by the company Grail behind them, American company, were just one of the first and biggest to market. So, and they're the first to have a massive trial of this scale. So this big trial that's going on, 140,000 people are signed up to it and going through 3 years of follow-up of this use of this test, looking at a panel of 50 markers of potential cancers. So, sorry, just got that bit out of the way and a reminder to people.
That's important context, yeah.
Yeah, I have to say I was pretty shocked when I opened my BMJ. So the BMJ arrives in a recyclable paper wrapper, so you can't see what's on it till you rip the wrapper open, and suddenly there's this picture of a big gold chalice tipped over, and the blood dripping out is in the shape of a question mark. So it's very evocative stuff. I mean, obviously, I guess calling it Grail, as in Holy Grail, is it does leave itself open to that kind of metaphor, but it was a pretty sensationalist thing for the BMJ, as an evidence, and as a journal, a respected medical journal. The article is authored by Dr. Margaret McCartney and Deborah Cohen, who are both respected in their own fields. But I thought it was a bit of an odd article because there's this leaked something, which obviously shares concerns that people are privately sharing. I mean, and I'm assuming those concerns related to the recent interim evidence that came out, and NHS England decided not to change the course of the trial and not to go for an accelerated roll to the program, but to pause and wait for the full trial to be completed in another 18 months, 2 years. So there wasn't much else in there that was investigative journalism. And I certainly didn't see any new medical evidence, which is why I was surprised it got such high profile. What did you said you reached out to Harper and you've got their response? So give us a summary.
Just before I touch on that, I always think, in government, when something is leaked, you always have to follow the trail to see whose interest is it in to leak it. And that usually tells you something as to where this is coming from. But yeah, I mean, look, you've got Richard Sullivan, Director of Institute of Cancer Policy at King's College London, respected institution. I don't know Richard, but he says the Grail deal is a clear-cut case of public risk and private profit. You've then got somebody who they've quoted from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in LA, who says, I don't think the evidence was sufficiently strong to warrant the trial. He says, I do not think the trial is ethical. So you're right. It does really put it out there. And what we're going to do is we'll put a snap of the front of the BMJ, because I realize it's not reading that everybody gets. We'll put a snap of the front cover and a link to the article on our socials. But yeah, you mentioned the Grail response. which Harpal sent us. And basically, what they say is, we're proud of the scientific and ethical rigor of the Gallery trial. The suggestion published by the BMJ the trial is unethical is false and misleading. As
Strong.
one component of its ambition to diagnose 3/4 of all cancers at an early stage, which was my policy when I was the cancer
Yeah.
minister, NHS England has considered an opportunity to implement a pilot of the Gallery test in England prior to full completion of the trial if early results were exceptionally compelling. And this is the bit you're referring to. Following a snapshot of only the first year results from the trial, NHS England decided to await final results from the full 3-year trial before determining whether to indicate a pilot of the Gallery test in the NHS. So while they're saying it's very promising, they're saying that it's not there yet. So
Yeah.
in some ways, I suppose what I wondered in reading all of this is this all a bit early doors to be making this kind of accusation?
Well, I think the first thing, if it is a trial ethical or not, I think is a massive professional accusation. And I think legally that has major implications because that goes to the heart of our ethical research process in the UK. You know, we pride ourselves in the UK that medical research is done to the highest standard. We have research ethics committees which are held to account for the decision making. So that is a really big accusation. And I'm sure that the response from Grail partly is pushing back at that from a legal context. So I bet there's lawyers all over this one.
And just on that, Helen, they say that the
Yeah,
study underwent UK regulatory and ethical review and approval.
yeah, we'll
It's
have
being
to.
and it's being conducted under approved United States FDA investigational device exemption application. So they answer that by saying that it has gone through the regulatory
Yeah.
process. It has. Sorry to interrupt. I just thought it
No,
was
no,
important
but
to
no,
make
that's
that point.
really good clarification. So then there's that bit, and then the rest of it then seems a bit more, as you say, the leaked stuff and conjecture. And I think, you know, and ethical impropriety, a terrible accusation. That'll go to the lawyers will be sorting that one out. But it does leave a stain, mud sticks. But the second bit then is about the decision that will be made ultimately. Now, NHS England take massive decisions about contracts very, very seriously. And again, there'll be scientists and ethicists and external people all over it. So I think this is, as you say, possibly rather early to be saying that. I mean, I think if the fact they had the courage to say, well, we said we would do an interim check-in on this. We did the check-in. It's looking promising, but we're not there yet. We'll carry on with the original plan. I don't think is news. So anyway, let's see. Let's see what happens next. I mean, as a principle, these multi-cancer tests that look for tiny bits of DNA that have broken off from tumors circulating in the blood of people long before the tumors are evident in other ways is promise. It's a step forward. It's something we never had before. And for most of these cancers, there's no sort of screening or early detection option available. So you could argue that even if there are only small improvements, that they're better than what we have now. Of course, the question that comes in a state-funded health system is the cost justifiable? And that's we absolutely need the health economists all over this before the NHS commits to using a test of this nature. And it's right that we have the ethical discussions about screening time and time again. We must have those, but suggesting that a commissioned, approved trial is unethical in some way is a big accusation. So yeah, lots of ripples from this one.
It is, and look, you can, listeners, you can judge for yourself. We'll post the links, as I said, and that front cover. The only thing I would just say, finally, Helen, is that at the end of the day, this and scrutiny is good. We live in democracy. That's what a
Yeah.
free press is all about. But at the end of the day, you have a trial here. Clue is in the name. You have a trial here. What you actually have out there in the marketplace, which people today will be paying a lot of money for,
Yeah.
are multi-cancer early detection tests that you can go into the private sector, you can go to private GP services, and you can buy these tests, which I would suggest require quite a lot more scrutiny than an approved trial is getting at the moment, because they're actually out there giving people that information in real time, for which you're paying quite a lot of money for. And of course, this would be an NHS service. So, maybe there's the next bit of the investigation for BMJ if they haven't already done that. Should we take a break? And then we're going to talk about MPox.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back. It's time to talk about MPox, Steve. What do you know about MPox?
Well, I know that it's called MPox these days. And of course, it was known as monkeypox MPox, and I don't really know what the sensitivity is about why that's been changed. But anyway, what MPox is health chiefs here in the UK, so and the WHO working with them, say they're putting in place plans in case this new type of MPox virus is detected here in the country in any numbers. But they're saying that the risk is particularly low. So it was previously known as monkeypox, as I said. It's a highly contagious virus that can cause very painful skin lesions. And if you look online, you will see what that looks like. They've got a big problem in parts of Africa at the moment. It's also been detected in Sweden, where somebody, I think, had been staying in Africa and then traveled to the country. And what have you ever seen MPox clinically?
Never. So look, I'm a frontline NHS GP, but I don't work in A&E. I'm no longer working in sexual health, although I did that a long time ago. But this is one that's pretty distinctive from the books. So it's a pox virus like chicken pox and previously smallpox. So you get these classic round raised lesions, and people can look easily online and find pictures of them. They've got little pus in them. And actually, it's easy to confuse with chickenpox in the early stages, which is why GPs have been alerted around the UK. And the big question is, have you been in contact with somebody with MPox, or have you been to particularly West Africa recently? One of the challenges with it is it can be quite slow for the symptoms to start appearing after you've become infected. So up to 3 weeks. You are most contagious when you've got symptoms and you've got these rashes, because the transmission is usually by close physical contact. So that's any contact with the blisters and scabs. That means touching bedding or towels, but also it can be by the respiratory route. So coughs and sneezes do spread MPox diseases. There's lots of stuff on the NHS website, of course, about it. Just nhs.uk and search MPox. And the prevention is all the usual stuff that we know well for viral protection. The key thing on this one, however, is if you think you're infected, it's not to go to your GP. It's actually sexual health clinics that are specialising in this one. And of all the vaccination programs that we previously had in the UK, which have now been scaled back, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get them up again, were run through sexual health clinics, because the big outbreak we saw in the UK of the previous variant was mostly amongst men who have sex with men, men who have quite a lot of sexual contact, and people who had been traveling to Africa. So there was a vaccination program. You needed 2 doses to be protected. Now I think you can only get vaccinated in Birmingham and Manchester, but you can call NHS 111 to find out more if you are worried. I think that's the limit of my knowledge, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit involved in this in the last Parliament when I was chairing the Select Committee, because of 2022, WHO declared this outbreak of Clade 2 MPox, it's called, to be a public health emergency. And then that was lifted in May last year. And we actually visited, in my role as chair of the all-party group on HIV and AIDS, actually, we visited the Dean Street Clinic in the West End in London.
Very good.
Where they were very concerned, about availability of vaccine, and also about it basically taking over the day job. So, they were worried about its impact on all the other work that they do around STIs, because there were so many people that were coming in needing that. And you're right. My understanding is that lots of people did get the initial vaccine, but because it fell back and the cases declined quite quickly, lots of people thought it had gone away, didn't get the second vaccine, and that now could be a concern. So I think that's one of the reasons why UK Health Security Agency are concerned, is they feel that people are undercovered in terms of their immune protection.
Okay. And just to be clear, it's not just about the rash. It's like any of these nasty viruses. It can be flu-like illness, muscle aches, lots of energy, lack of energy, big swollen glands, and I mean it's killed a few people. So it's it's a nasty one, and lazy low. So okay, what
right.
next?
We're going to talk about puberty blockers next, Helen.
Yes.
So the British Medical Association, which we discuss a lot on this podcast, and I have a feeling we might discuss again before this episode is out, have called for a ban on puberty blockers for under 18s to be lifted. They also want a pause on the implementation of a landmark review into gender care for children and young people. They say they want to undertake an evaluation of the Cass review. Hilary Cass did that for the last government after academics expressed concern about its approach. Goodness me. what do you feel at the front end, at the front door of the NHS? How much experience have you had, Helen, as a frontline GP, of people coming in looking to have a conversation along these lines?
Really interesting, Steve. So I'll answer that last bit first, and then go back a bit about the whole picture of this. So, as a GP, until the last 3, 4 years, issues around puberty blockers just weren't something that were in my lexicon. We always had one or, I mean, I've been working in very large practices. We always had a 1 or 2 patients on our books who had changed their gender years before and took hormones to keep continuity. In fact, most of them were male to female, and this had been people lived in their new gender and all was fine. Some of them had the surgery and so on. No real drama there. It was just we help people as best we can. Then suddenly in the last few years, massive upswing in younger women asking for help to transition to become men, and a lot of publicity around this, and a lot of publicity about particularly some private clinics, but the Tavistock Clinic in London giving people, young people in their teens, hormones, or what we call puberty blockers, to suppress their natural production of hormones and delay the onset of puberty. So in a sense, the logic was it would buy them time to work out that what gender they wanted to be living in future. So the argument was it would increase their options. But there's been a lot of concern raised, and we won't rehash all that now. And very wisely, NHS England commissioned an independent review. So this was Dr. Hilary Cass led it, but obviously there were a team of people working with her. Hilary is a very, very respected paediatrician, former president of the Royal College of Paediatricians, and a thoroughly honest person. And she was quite courageous to take this on, because this is one of those very toxic spaces where there's a lot of polarized debate. So Hilary took it on, and over the last 4 years, this comprehensive review has been done. They've commissioned systematic reviews of the literature. I think York University won the tender and did, I think, 7 different systematic reviews, and came up with an interim report, which is what led to NHS England stopping the use of puberty blockers last year. I think you know about that, because that was when you were select committee. And then subsequently the final report has just come out, and it's very clear cut, and so the ban is now being extended to private clinics as well. I think that's where we're up to. And then suddenly, out of the blue, the BMA, which is a trades union, came out with a rather unexpected statement saying that they're concerned about this review and the review needs to be reviewed. I'm not happy about that, I have to say, but back to you.
I'm guessing that I'm getting that sense. So you don't often sign public letters these days, Helen,
I
but
don't.
I think you have in this case, haven't you?
I have. Yeah, it's very rare I sign a public letter, because I've just got to be careful with my various roles and my public profile. And I think it's really important for me to remain very firmly politically neutral. But I did sign the one about this, along with about at least 1,000 other doctors and academics and high-profile leaders. This is about academic integrity being undermined by pressure groups, as far as I can work it out. And honestly, in the UK, we need to be better than this. This is the BMA's remit is not this space. This is where the colleges are, and indeed the colleges have come out quite firmly in supporting of this independent review. I just think it's a very divisive thing that's happened. I'm going to step off my soapbox before I say something I regret. But yeah, not often I
What'll be
sign a
really
letter.
what'll be really interesting, won't it, is with your new job down in New Zealand, is to see how these issues, which are very big cultural
Mm.
divisive issues here in the UK, to see how they play out in a completely different environment.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I mean, in Australia and New Zealand, the issue about puberty blockers and people transitioning, questioning their gender identity is a very big conversation there too. And they've looked, and Hilary Cass's review has been taken globally as the gold standard. There are people around the world who say, "Wow, the UK led the world by commissioning this review." It's very high caliber, and so they're grateful for it, actually. But and yeah, I think this is going to run and run, Steve.
Yeah, right. Okay. We're going to talk about the Care Quality Commission, Helen.
Hmm.
Do you know Dr. Penny Dash?
I don't know her personally, but I do know that she was commissioned to do a review of the reviewers, as they say.
Yeah. So Penny
Investigate the
brought out,
investigators.
yeah, she brought out an interim report last month, at the end of July, The body responsible for inspecting NHS hospitals, GP surgeries, care homes, and now integrated care systems in England is not fit for purpose, said the Health Secretary in response to this report. He said he was stunned by the scale of the problems.
Yeah.
And of course, you always have to see this in the context of he is a politician, and it all fits into the narrative of we've inherited a sinking ship, etc., etc. But obviously, the reviewer, Dr. Dash, has not been lent on politically. She's come up
No.
with a very interesting evidence-based piece of work. And, there are all sorts of failings that got widespread media coverage at the time. So, inspectors lacking necessary experience, some being asked to inspect hospitals having never been into it before, care home inspectors who'd never met a person with dementia, some hospitals having gone more than 10 years since their last inspection. And all of this blew up in the media. And of course, now what we're waiting for is the final report, which I think is due out in the autumn. My response to this, for what it's worth, Helen, as a former minister, is that a lot in the world has changed post-pandemic. A lot in the world of healthcare has changed anyway, regardless of pandemic. And what you've now got is a lot of generalist inspectors who are going into different settings, and people warned about the dangers of this at the time. And you've got generalist view of inspection. And of course, that is going to create some kickback. There are going to be people who are saying, well, hold on a minute, we know this area better than the inspector, who is apparently holding some sort of sword of Damocles above our head. So, if you look at some of the response from people like NHS providers, for instance, they would say that that is one of the major impacts, which is people coming in to do inspections who are lacking experience. So this came a bit out of left field, didn't it? But people who know this space knew that this review was going on, and maybe some are not surprised.
Well, I have to say, it did come out of left field for me in terms of an interim report. We knew that this was going on and there was going to be the big report due in the autumn. I didn't expect to hear for months yet. So I think the interim, I think this was a special request from a Secretary of State for an interim report. And as you say, a lot was spoken about it. I have to say, for all the ills and criticisms of CQC, the concept certainly helped uncover and remedy a lot of awful bad practice when they first came in. So initially in the care sector, just setting minimum standards for hygiene and cleanliness and organizational and confidentiality. And these were really good things as a starting point, and certainly in general practice. I vividly remember when they started, and there was a huge backlash from general practice saying, sort of, how dare you suggest that we don't run our practices properly. But indeed, they discovered some GP practices where there was awful stuff going on. No doors and consulting rooms, some horrible infection control practices, which it's too early in the morning to talk about, but rats and fridges come to mind. And no process and protocols for dealing with things. So it really did professionalize everyone. But of course, the vast majority of care systems were fine and good already, and it created a huge amount of bureaucracy and a whole machinery to do with it. So I think we need to wait for the full report to come out to reserve judgment on it. I'm just fascinated by the process at the moment.
I think I was sort of surprised by the very robust response from some people. I mean, I mentioned NHS providers. They said, we've been calling for urgent reform of the CQC for years. We fully agree with all the recommendations. You've got Care England, who said that their members had been raising these concerns for a long time. But, this is an entirely necessary journey. And the interim chief exec at the CQC said that, they accept the findings in full. So that this really matters. I mean, we talked before about morale of people working in the NHS around pay, around strikes, around saying the NHS is broken. If you are sitting there in a setting that has been given a good CQC rating, how does this make you feel? That this isn't worth the paper it's written on? Equally, if you've been given a challenging CQC rating, does that make you question whether that's right? And then it sort of undermines your confidence as a healthcare professional as to the setting that you're working in and whether it's worth your candle. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Anyway, should we take a break?
Welcome back. Let's hit the button. Right, Helen, pod surgery this time. One of the stories we're going to touch on is vaginal mesh, which is
Yes.
a difficult subject for gentlemen to talk about, but it's a subject that this gentleman talked a lot about when he chaired the select committee. What is this story all about? Because I feel very certain that you've had patients talking to you about this one over the years.
Oh, an awful lot of this one over the years, yeah. And as a reminder, before I became a general practitioner, I actually trained in gynecology. It was mostly gynae cancer, but I did an awful lot of urogynae, which is prolapses and things like this. So vaginal mesh. So mesh is basically a sort of a piece of fabric used internally to help hoik things up, which is put into place to help support the pelvic floor. And there have been a lot of problems with women who have developed long-term complications from having a mesh inserted. And it took a very long time for women to be believed that there was actually an issue here. This is one of these cases where the medical profession hasn't covered itself in glory, in that although people were raising the alarm from a couple of years after it started being used, it took a very long time before there was a pause on its use. And I mean, I must be honest, I have many patients who have vaginal meshing who absolutely love it, who think it's brilliant and has helped them get their lives back. But we know there are tens of thousands of women in the UK who are in chronic pain and troubled by this. Some have had the mesh removed. And the development this week is that there's been a payout for compensation for the first 100 or so of the women who've taken legal action on it. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah, and that's come from a campaign group who brought this action called Sling the Mesh, which
Right.
obviously we've heard from a lot on the select committee. And it is good, and it's about time that action was taken to compensate. But there are many more not compensated by this. Lots of women have missed out on payouts because of a deadline to claim. So it's important to increase the time limits, and that's what brings some of these 100 women into scope, if you like. But
Right.
there's an awful long way to go on this, and it all comes back to the work that Baroness Cumberledge did, if you
Yes.
remember, um,
Gave
in
evidence.
in the first Do No Harm work.
Mm.
And yeah, it's this one is definitely going to run and run. But it's a bit like a lot of these, like infected blood, like postmasters. Actually, people are getting on, people are aging, and their lives are impacted
Blighted.
seriously by this. So speedy skates need to be got on, because I know the frustration in this sector around this, that it's just still taking too long.
That Baroness Cumberledge review was interesting because it covered vaginal mesh, the use of sodium valproate, so an anti-epileptic used also in severe mental health problems, but causes terrible adverse outcomes if used in pregnancy, and also a drug that was used back in the 50s and 60s called Primados, which
Riddles,
was
yeah.
believed to cause congenital malformation. So it was a really interesting mix, and yeah, I gave evidence in that one because I was chair of the RCGP. Actually, in terms of compensation, there's been another positive progress story in the news this week again about the infected blood. Compensation payouts are finally starting to flow for those infected by the infected blood historical problem. So just that's another one to flag, because we've spoken about that before.
Yes, there's the people who are infected, and what they're now wanting to do is to, this is Robert Francis, who's leading
Mm,
the Conversation Authority.
don't want
What
issue
they
road
want to
fine.
now is to hear from people who've been affected. So people, the scheme does two things: the people who've been infected, and then the people who've been affected who cared for people who were infected.
Yeah.
So all information on government website. We're also going to talk just briefly about GPs, because we talked a lot last
Mm,
time about how the British Medical Association, them again, had released the details of their ballot, that
mhm.
GPs in England have launched this work to rule action in their dispute with the government over what they say is lack of funding through
Mm.
the GP contract. And, it really does threaten to bring a lot of chaos to the system. And I just wondered, out there in GP land, what is actually happening at the moment? Because maybe you could just explain the menu of options that GP practices are able to draw from in response to this work to rule action, because it's not a strike, it's work to rule.
No, it's definitely not a strike. Yeah, thanks, Steve. It's been an interesting time. So since the ballot closed and GPs were told, right, over to you, you can make the choice for your own practice, which of these list of 9 or 10 things, depending on which way you cut it, you want to implement in your own surgery. And as you say, they're all work to rule issues. So that GPs will not be breaking contract anywhere. They will only be, what they're going to do is peel back on the stuff they're not contracted to do. The biggest one of these that is causing the greatest alarm, I think, is limiting the number of daily contacts per doctor to the European recommended safe maximum of 25 patients a day. So that's the safe maximum. That's not a recommended number. That is the absolute maximum. And so that if that does happen, that will have a very significant impact, because a lot more patients will get turned away from practices, which means they'll need to seek care elsewhere, whether that's NHS 111 or A&E departments. And I know our colleagues there are dreading that. What's been interesting to me is there hasn't been a sudden influx of practices saying, right, we're going to do all of them, we're going to crack on with this. And we had a really interesting, I mean, I don't talk about my own practice normally, but I will share with you that we had a really interesting discussion about this. And some of the things on the list are things that over the last year or so we'd already decided to do, which were actually, we're not going to comply with yet another request to do this or that. We're going to push back firmly and politely and just say, I'm sorry, we have no capacity to help you with this thing that you want to do. And we're not making any public statement as a practice about it. If we decide to do anything, we'll just do them discreetly and in our way. But other practices, I think there are some practices out there that are saying to patients, actually, yes, we're publicly going to do this. We are publicly going to tell you we're doing this. I think all GP practices are using this moment to point out to patients the funding challenges that we've got. I mean, if you recall, this vote happened and was in advance of the new government, or whilst the elections were happening. New government came in. Then the DDRB, the doctors' review body, recommended a 6% pay increase, which the new government agreed to honour. And there was an issue about newly qualified GPs struggling to find work. So an extra 83 million was found to help employ these doctors. And so those two big things came in at about the same time. The BMA was saying, oh, well, the ballot is to do this action. And I think it's left GPs a bit confused, going, well, we asked for these things. And in fairness, we have got them. Although I think everyone's waiting to see the colour of the money, because no money's flown through yet. Even though we've passed the money, we've said we'll pass the money on, pay rise to our staff. We haven't seen any cash yet. So it's an interesting limbo time. I think the next month, 6 weeks, things will be clarified.
Yes. I mean, I think there's good and bad here for GPs. We say that this is all things NHS. Here's the political twist bit. Obviously, the new government have responded positively to the pay settlements that you talked about there through the gender change cohort, the junior doctors with their 22%, the rail drivers, the train drivers who had their settlement. And there's been some criticism of that, which is, hold on a minute, there's a £20 billion black hole. You're suggesting you might have to put up taxes to meet this, yet you're cutting winter fuel allowance for pensioners and you're giving big pay deals to the public sector. That's a legitimate political challenge that is coming from the opposition, from my old side of the house, to the government, and they will have to answer all that in the budget in October. Now, you could say that in the weeks between now and the budget, they will settle with the doctors, and previous performance is an indicator of future behavior. They will give the doctors, the GPs, what they want to. The other side of that coin is that criticism may start to bite, and they may feel that it's politically difficult to do that.
Yeah.
And so you might find that the GPs, the BMA, and the Junior Doctors Committee stay in dispute with the government for longer than they want. And I don't know, crystal ball, I don't know which of those two it's going to be at the moment, but it'll be one or the other. Anyway, we're going to wrap up, but you just wanted to give a shout out to a colleague of yours who's been doing some amazing things to raise some money.
I did. Dr. Subo Dave, a consultant psychiatrist up the road from me in Derbyshire. He lives just in Sutton Coldfield. He has run over 1,100 miles this year whilst fundraising for Doctors in Distress, which is a sort of suicide prevention charity for doctors. He's been doing a marathon a month. But in August, he's just done an ultra marathon called the Comrades Marathon in South Africa. It's one of those crazy things you can't quite get your head around, Steve. It's over 90 kilometers, this race, so that's longer than a double marathon. I just can't get my head around it. So well done to Subo and to anybody else taking part in that for charity. But we do need to wrap up. How is Monty?
Well done to him. How is Monty? Well, he's had a lovely holiday down in the West Country. He enjoyed being in the sea, but for those who listen who are dog owners will know that dogs go in the sea, they bite the waves, swallow salt water, and then it only goes one way, which is never nice. But he did enjoy Lost Withiel, which I picked up earlier because that was inland. There were some beautiful, beautiful rivers and streams with fresh, clean water, which he went in every morning. He got up, went out for his wee, and went straight into the river. And this is manna from heaven for Monty. He is frustrated though because our next door neighbours have been on holiday, and my son has been feeding their chickens, and
Oh,
Monty can hear one of them, which um, seems to be like a rooster all day making this noise. Anyway, Monty can hear them from our garden and he's absolutely desperate to get round there and has promised that he would only help get the chickens to bed as opposed to actually eat them. I'm not so sure about this, but he's currently sound asleep under the podcast desk. So there's your Monty update.
thank you very much. And I think we're coming to the end of the summer holiday season. I think both of us have got some holiday to look forward to. So next time we can feedback on our travels.
We can indeed. Okay, podcast at stevebryan.com. Find us on social media. We'll pop some of those links to some of the stuff we have discussed, and we'll see you next time. Bye, Helen.
Bye.